Well, good morning. Chuck Belanger here with Maizex Seeds. Welcome to you and everyone joining us from across Canada for our Decipher, Debate, and Decide 2021 Agronomy Series. Our goal with this series is to provide you with the ideas to increase yield and profitability. This week, our topic is Xtend versus Enlist, pros, cons, and consideration. Our guest speaker today will be Mike Calbro, OMAFRA Field Crop Weed Control Specialist. Mike has been a game changer when it comes to getting weed control information out to the growers. He's the editor of the Bible, publication 75. Add to that problem weed control guides, pest manager apps, videos, and a truly engaging speaker. It is really great to have Mike with us here today. Also joining us today for the discussion is our own color commentator, Henry Prinzen. Henry is our own territory manager for Maizex, covering the area from Niagara to Elmer, just south of the 401. Henry has been recently married, building a new house, farms on the side, and is a great asset to all of us here at the Maizex team. The first 45 minutes of this session will focus on laying out the information, and this will also be followed with an open question and answer period. As the presentation goes along, be sure to use the webinar question box to send any questions in, and we will get to them, as many of them as possible at the end. With that, let's turn it over to Mike and Henry. Have a go at it, guys.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Chuck. Appreciate that. Let's just get into it in terms of comparing the different herbicide tolerant trait systems. So if we look at the Enlist soybean system, it has tolerance to 3 herbicides that normally would kill soybeans, right? So we have glyphosate, 2,4-D choline, a low volatility version of 2,4-D, and glufosinate. If we compare that to Roundup Ready to Xtend, that system has tolerance to glyphosate and dicamba. So there's 3 products available in the marketplace: Ingenia, Fexapan, and Xtendamax. And then more recently, there'll be soybean tolerant varieties this year available called Xtend Flex soybeans. And I imagine moving forward, this will be the predominant herbicide tolerant trait, with dicamba as kind of the centerpiece. So Xtend Flex soybeans have tolerance to glyphosate, dicamba, and then glufosinate. So that's kind of the breakdown of the different traits in terms of what they're tolerant to. If we look at the pros and cons of these different systems, I'm going to take this from the perspective, Henry, as someone that's probably already ordered or is going to plant Enlist soybeans for the upcoming season. That's the approach I'm going to take. So if we compare, say, Enlist to the Xtend platform, really it boils down to, do you want to spray 2,4-D for weed control, or do you want to look at dicamba? And so, you know, if we look at the Enlist E3 soybean system, let's compare 2,4-D choline versus dicamba. I think in general, 2,4-D has good control of a number of broadleaf weeds, but I would probably give the nod to dicamba. Dicamba is just a little bit better overall on broadleaf weeds, and we'll get into some specific examples. 2,4-D choline has no residual weed control, so it breaks down fairly quickly in the soil. Whereas dicamba, you can probably expect 2 to 3 weeks of residual broadleaf weed control. Maybe you push that to 4 weeks, but that'd be a pretty tall order. And then lastly,
if it's going to rain on us, though, we're not going to get much residual control out of dicamba at all, are we?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, dicamba is very water soluble. So if you got like a heavy rainfall, yeah, like you could, it'll move in the soil pretty good. Yeah, like the breakdown of dicamba is driven by moisture and heat. So lots of moisture, warm temperatures, that residual window is going to be relatively small versus, you know, cooler temperatures, less rainfall. So yeah, completely good point. I think, you know, practically speaking, you'll get a week or 2 of residual control at the high rate. Worst case scenario, best case scenario, maybe that goes to 3 to 4 weeks. But that's, you know, that's a good point. I don't think, you know, we used to use this product. Chuck probably used it all the time in corn, right? And it was kind of the standard broadleaf residual herbicide. there's been a lot of concern both in the US and Canada around drift, particularly to non-tolerant soybeans. And in general, and we'll show some research on that, soybeans are less sensitive to 2,4-D, and they're a lot more sensitive to dicamba. You'll probably see injury in both scenarios, but dicamba is just a little bit tougher from a yield loss perspective. All right. So what you're seeing on the screen here now, back in December, I reached out to a number of agronomists across the province and just asked them quite simply, what weeds do you normally struggle with that give you the greatest amount of grief? So in this little word cloud, this kind of summarizes a lot of the challenges provincially. So lambs, quarters, and Canada fleabane you see as kind of the pillars of problematic weeds in Ontario, and then you get into the ragweeds and water hemp and pigweed and lambs quarters. Is that jive with you, Henry, or is there other problems that are void from this list?
Well, like we said, I cover Niagara, right? We got a bit of scentless chamomile problems. That would be maybe another one to, it's not on the list, but that can cause some serious, problems in Niagara specifically, right? But for the most part, I think that covers the list really well.
Yeah. So we can touch on scentless chamomile, and so if we look kind of very broadly and then narrow our focus in on these technologies, as a general rule in soybeans, if we look at systems that make these problem weeds less of a hassle versus more of a hassle, in terms of like consistency of control, we get more consistent weed control throughout the season when we implement like either a 2-pass weed control system, so putting down a soil applied pre-emergent herbicide and then coming back with Enlist Duo in the case of E3 soybeans, or sequential applications. So for example, 2 passes of Enlist Duo. I guess I'm curious, Henry, what kind of, on your own farm, what's your approach to weed control in soybeans, and does it vary from field to field? Like what's your overall game plan there?
Yeah, so I mean, last year we were Xtend platform. This year we actually bought both platforms. I just went, based on genetics, pick the best varieties, right? But in the past I've been boundary Aragon merge Roundup on my corn stalk ground that's going to get beans, and then my bean on bean ground, because we do 2 years of beans in a row here. It's been Canopy Pro Aragon merge Roundup. So I think, some of these new systems might give us a little bit more flexibility to not go so heavy up front. Yeah, I don't know what you think, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of considerations there. So the one thing I like that you said off the bat, which I think is a really good point, is you pick the best genetics. Like Enlist, Xtend, like at the end of the day, they both can do a pretty good job of a lot of the problem weeds, and the differences are kind of minute. Like ultimately you pick the best variety, and that's what should drive your decision making. We can make either system work, right? I'm interested, like it sounds like a lot of the drivers in that kind of soil applied plan for you must be Canada fleabane, or what's kind of the driver there in terms of some of those decisions?
Yeah, we have pretty clean farms, Canada fleabane's the main driver now. We've been, Acuron in corn, so our fields are pretty clean in corn stalks. Yeah, I picked boundary on the corn stalks. It has maybe better grass control. And then I was going canopy on our beans on beans because Classic does a pretty good job on some of those bigger dandelions and, maybe the wild carrot that's out there, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Like I just threw some numbers up on the screen. Like prices varied, dealer may sell for more or less, right? But I like to throw numbers up there just to kind of see, in a 2-pass system, you alluded to it, Henry, that kind of, if you were to say a negative of it is that you'll spend more money per acre because, the soil applied herbicides are in that $20 to $26 range an acre, Boundary Liquid, Canopy Pro. And then, you could come back with Post with Enlist Duo, and that runs you $14 an acre. So you're getting up to around $40 an acre. I guess I'm curious now for you, recognizing that you are spending a little bit more upfront, what's the value you see in doing that?
Well, I mean, I think I look at it, Mike. Last year, actually, we only had 20% of our bean acres. We actually came back in with Roundup, we saved the pass. Now it was we got a wet spring actually in Haldimand. We got our residuals activated and then it got dry, so we didn't have a second flush. But if you look at it as even 1 in 4 years, I don't have to go back with that second pass, $10 to go through with the sprayer, $10 in glyphosate, and long term, I keep my weeds to a minimum. I think that's a strategy, right? When you go with the, let's call it the 2-pass program with Enlist Duo, in theory, you're guaranteeing you're coming back, right? There's no way to go around that.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good, that's a good point. You kind of hope for the best sounds like you hope for the best with your pre-pass and you expect the worst. And if you don't have to go back in a second time, great. If not, that was kind of expected. I think personally, I like the soil applied treatment up front just because it does buy me, like when we run into problems in the post-emergent window with control, it's usually because weed stage is beyond where it should be. And I find the soil applied herbicides just afford you a little bit more wiggle room on the timing side. Yeah, because I mean, dollars and cents wise, like the 2-pass program that you see if your strategy was like, I'll just go Enlist Duo once or twice, like, yeah, that is cheaper. But yeah, to your point, some years you get away with just a soil applied herbicide on its own. You don't have to go and post. And then here timing becomes pretty critical with both passes. Yeah, so it seems to me, Henry, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that you kind of almost use the herbicide tolerant portion, Enlist Duo, XtendiMax, whatever it is, almost as a rescue, right? If things go south, you have 2 modes of action for broadleaf weed control that'll cover a lot of your challenges.
Yeah,
Fair?
I think that's the best way to look at it. That's what, our strategy at home is. Yeah, it's worst case scenario, I have to come back and maybe I missed a flea bane or two. It'd be nice to have the flexibility of, maybe Enlist because it's a little less volatile than Xtend.
Right. Cool. I like it. So let's just break down kind of comparison of different weed species and kind of how the components in Enlist and Xtend stack up. So just for clarity, right, on this chart here, I've color coded on the basis of mode of action, just because one of the strategies, if you can do it, is to put more than one mode of action on your target weed. Like that's a good strategy to prevent or delay at least resistance. Lamb's quarters is the most abundant, one of the most competitive weeds in Ontario, and yet we always have control issues around glyphosate. I put this picture up on the screen with the lamb's quarters at less than 10 centimeters tall, or 4 inches, depending on where you live in the province. Just as as a snapshot of never allowing lamb's quarters to get any larger than that, because that's where we do run into the problems. And so, whether it's glyphosate, Liberty, Enlist One, which is the 2,4-D product, or Ingenia is one of the Dicamba products, they all do a good job of controlling lamb's quarters if they're small. The nice added benefit if you have lamb's quarters escapes with like an Enlist One glyphosate or Enlist One Liberty combo, you have 2 modes of action, a little bit more consistent control when it does get on the larger side, and at a fairly decent price point. So I think why tank mixing for lamb's quarters is important, because every year we probably get 10 to 15 queries at the University of Guelph about glyphosate resistant lamb's quarters, right? Like, so lamb's quarters is there, it's been sprayed with Roundup, it's not dying. We do some tests, it's never to this point been kind of found to be resistant. It's usually a size and kind of rate thing. The tank mix, I think, hedges your bet that you're going to get good control of that species. Canada fleabane, this is where we see differences in the product. So Henry, like, I imagine part of the mindset of using Canopy Pro and things like that up front is that's usually the Sencor based herbicide mixed with your burn down herbicide usually are the most effective at fleabane. Yet there's plenty of resistant fleabane in the province. Liberty, although in the US, they talk about it being decent on horseweed or Canada fleabane. Experience in Ontario has never been super great. and I can give a couple of reasons for that. Enlist one, I don't think it's like 2,4-D is just not a very good fleabane herbicide. I don't know what your experience has been, Henry. Like there's been plenty of work done on it. It's good if it's super small, but the reality is we're never targeting fleabane when it's like super small. What's
Yeah,
your,
I
have
mean,
you,
most of my experience would be with like Blackhawk, let's say, and it's good. It's not amazing.
that's being pretty diplomatic, Henry. Good is, yeah,
uh,
I think we're not telling any tales out of school that Blackhawk and 2,4-D, they're not great on flea. Like they're decent burn down herbicides. Fleabane is not where they shine. Ingenia is a better product, but you can overcome it, right? Like, so, you know, here's Peter Sycamores' work. It's pretty representative of 2,4-D control on Canada fleabane. You would look at that and not be overly pleased. But, you know, you throw in throw in a little Sencor in the mix, right? 220 grams per acre of dry Sencor, and that 2,4-D, you know, burn down looks pretty good, right? So I think that's the big take home for people watching today is Enlist overall pretty good on a lot of the, you know, glyphosate resistant weeds and even things like lamb's quarters. It's a nice little broadleaf component, but fleabane is one where you have to spend a little extra attention. And yeah, I don't know.
so,
That's
so
all.
Mike, for the guys that can't really put a residual down, there's a bunch of them out there because they're growing veggie crops in the following year. Is Enlist One plus Aragon a good option to look after my fleabane? And then, maybe I'm coming back in with an Enlist One Liberty combo, smoking the fleabane if, I still get some escapes.
I like it. No, I think that's a great suggestion, Henry. Like, yeah, so you run into either there's rotational concerns, or maybe you're on a soil type where I'm not gonna like sandy soil, less than 2% organic matter, probably not wanting to put Sencor down, right? Yeah, I think the mixing of Aragon with 2,4-D would offer similar levels of control. And to your point, yeah, like 2,4-D post, probably not a great option for fleabane. Maybe that's where the Liberty 2,4-D, like I think the Liberty 2,4-D tank mix, we haven't done a lot of it in Ontario. They do more of it in the US. I think there's some kind of neat possibilities there that could be explored. I think that's one of them. So yeah, it's a good suggestion. And here would be my point on like kind of where I see the weakness of Liberty on fleabane is this is growth room work. So like conditions are hot, humid. We're using flat fan nozzles for goodness sake. So coverage isn't an issue. We're doing it at 20 gallons an acre. I think the chamber speed's around 4 miles per hour. So coverage is not an issue. And yet, 10, 15 centimeter tall fleabane, we get a lot of regrowth. We almost need to be at 2x rate or mixing it with like urea ammonium nitrate. But to your point, Henry, maybe we take this Liberty on its own, mix it with 2,4-D and get it to kind of this stage on the right. I don't know for sure. Like I know there's some work in the US that shows that combo on a bunch of weeds is nicer. But yeah, that would be a good solution.
So Mike, the Liberty and 1 liter per acre and 28% UAN, is you talking that as a carrier, as a burn down, or are you talking that in crop?
Yes, Chuck, you're paying too close attention to my photos. This was me doing some exploratory stuff to see if I could make this work out in the field. And so, yeah, like Liberty is just inconsistent. And, with crops where there's not, like to Henry's point, you can't use Sencor ahead of every crop, like if you're growing dry beans or something like that. And I noticed that, like, so that's as a carrier, Chuck. So that's 20 gallons per acre of UAN with Liberty. Kind of the idea there was, dry beans take some nitrogen fertilizer to begin with. Could you do that?
Yeah.
Look great in the growth room, not so great in the field, right? So this looks awesome here, but in real life, probably not, right? Giant ragweed, Henry, like I see giant ragweed all over the river edges around your neck of the woods, but I don't see it as often in the field. Is that becoming a problem or not? Not
No,
really.
it's not. I think like at this point, I think we're worried about it, but I actually haven't run into it resistant in, let's call it Haldeman. I know down in the Long Point area there is some glyphosate resistant giant ragweed, and it is an issue up there, right? But you know, the creek flats for now, I see it every year at home, and I'm just, you know, I'm scared. uh, I'm just waiting for it, I guess.
Probably bigger an issue in Chuck's neck of the woods, but like here's where Enlist does shine. Like, and again, Peter Sickham has done a fair amount of work on that historically. Like, you know, the first glyphosate-resistant weed in the province in 2,4-D ester is one of the reasons it got registered ahead of soys prior to this technology coming out. It was really good on giant ragweed, and so yeah, it is as well, and that's one of the strengths of the Enlist system, especially when that weed germinates over a long period of time and none of the residual herbicides really offer good control. Common ragweed is another sneaky weed from this perspective. Like you typically think of common ragweed as maybe being fairly easy to control with glyphosate, but there are resistant populations, although not many. But the big weakness of ragweed is that, again, once it gets bigger than 10 centimeters in height, it's really tolerant to glyphosate. Like if it's at above 10 centimeters, you need the 1.4 liter per acre rate of Transorb or whatever you like to use. And so that's where I do think, especially when you get in those borderline situations, the Enlist 1 combo or, you know, Ingenia really kind of ensures some consistency of ragweed control. And then water hemp, you know, I won't dwell on water hemp too much in that, other than we see it in more counties every year. Whenever we do find it, it's almost always, well, it's always resistant to Roundup, and it's usually resistant to 3 different modes of action, and in some cases 4. It's a pigweed plant, as you can see on the screen, and the seed moves around quite nicely by us. So I think it's probably just a matter of time for many people. Liberty hasn't been smoking hot on it, but again, like I think with this weed, soil applied herbicides will be the game plan. But for those, but you can only, most people only plan for that once they have a significant problem. So what's nice, I think, about either Enlist or Xtend soybeans is that first time where it pops up in the field, now at least you have something to do that you can use to control it. Because unfortunately, otherwise, it's resistant to like most of the herbicides that you would normally use on pigweed, like Reflex as an example. So yeah, I don't know, Henry, is it? It's not. I know it's in your area, but it's probably not widespread yet.
No, it's pretty much on one farm. You know, I thought we had it one time. It was green pigweed, you know,
Yeah.
some really big green pigweeds in the creek flats. You know, I did find some in Hamilton Wentworth this year. I think, you know, it was glyphosate resistant, but yeah, it's there. It's not on everyone's top hit list. I think everyone loves talking about it, but it's not in everyone's field.
Yeah, and I think what's going to happen is it'll pop up in a field, and it'll probably be too late to spray anyway. Or you find it where you could still spray it, and there's not that many plants that you could either just pull them out, or but if it's more than that, at least you could run in there with an Enlist 1 and do the job. Yeah, and just I guess all I want to show here, because you already mentioned it with fleabane. In the US, they're doing a lot more on this screen here. We see kind of water hemp control at 3 different heights, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters. All I want to point out here is like the Liberty plus 2,4-D option, which we could use in Enlist soybeans, provides a nice level of consistency and control, especially when you get into big weeds. So, you know, maybe this is the opportunity for fleabane. I get excited about this quite, and we'll talk about it for things like field horsetail or vetch. I think there's some things that we could look at there, or like growers could experiment with fairly cost effectively. And then wild carrot. I don't know, Henry, is this like I know, like I've done lots of scentless chamomile stuff in your neck of the woods. Wild carrot certainly there, but is that one that's it seemed to be pop up a lot this year? Just curious what your experience was this year.
I think more guys are getting it, and you know, I think it's more of, you know, once in a while you gotta just bite the bullet. There's just too many of them out there, and you got to do something about them. again, I think definitely more of a no-tiller kind of guy problem than the guys that are working the ground all the time. Yeah, I think that would be the story for me on carrot.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
So
finding like down like in Essex, like down here down toward Essex, we kind of had it under control for quite a while, and it just seems to be popping up even more and more now. And I don't know if it's because guys have moved away from some of this residual or some of this contact like classic, just to get away from some costs. I don't know.
I'm going to speculate, and I could be totally wrong because that's what speculation is. I think part of it is like if you get away from fall applications, like there's seedlings in the spring, there's seedlings in the fall. Fall control is so important. Like glyphosate does kill this. It does a lot better in the fall than in the spring. But you do need a hefty rate, like the 1.34 liter per acre rate, the same rate you'd use on dandelions. What I've heard is people like classic has been the solution in soybeans, and I've heard on a few occasions. So it's Xtend soybeans. They're using Ingenia. Ingenia and 2,4-D are both crap on wild carrot. It was the first, actually, wild carrot was the first herbicide-resistant weed in the province, and it was resistant to 2,4-D. But so they're using Ingenia, glyphosate, and Xtend soybeans. They're like, I'll throw some classic in. I would speculate the classic is a herbicide. Well, number one, wild carrot's not an easy target to hit. The leaves aren't big, they're lacy and stuff. You're now using the ultra coarse nozzles to prevent off-target drift from dicamba, but classic's much better utilized in kind of a medium to coarse droplet. I wonder if that's part of the challenge too. And you're going to run into that, unfortunately. So let's look at some cons. And I think one thing to keep on the radar, because we've seen this with volunteer corn control, but there have been some US studies, this is done in 2019, where you see a little bit of antagonism on the grass control with glyphosate. So glyphosate, as a general rule, is super good on grassy weeds. Grassy weeds are super sensitive to glyphosate. But barnyard grasses, I mean, globally, there's some glyphosate resistant populations. When it was tank mixed with either dicamba or 2,4-D, control reduced. So you see here, glyphosate on its own, we're getting above 90% control, regardless of whether it's 4 inches tall or 12 inches tall. Once it's tank mixed with dicamba and it gets on the large side, control, significantly is reduced, by about 10 or 15%. And same with 2,4-D. And I just bring this up because in the past, in Xtend soybeans, there have been some instances where barnyard grass in particular, control was poor, and they wondered whether it was resistance. I wonder whether part of it is antagonism. And so that's just something also to be mindful. Probably for most people, the more significant thing is volunteer corn control. So dicamba and 2,4-D antagonize like Assure 2 or any of those herbicides you use for volunteer corn control. So if you're someone that's kind of cut rates on those products, right? Like, Chuck, back in the day, you'd never use 150 milliliters per acre of Assure 2 to kill volunteer corn. You'd probably use 100 or 75 because it was, and I don't think you'll have that wiggle room with if you have dicamba or 2,4-D in the mix. So it's just something to be mindful of. The next kind of con is, so again, survey of a number of agronomists, what are some of the issues provincially? Dicamba drift is one that popped up. So that's the big elephant in the room. Let's tackle it. With both of these weed control systems, whether it's Enlist or Xtend, we have to be super mindful of off-target drift. There's physical drift and there's vapor drift. Right, physical drift can be managed pretty easily because that's just day of application. What's the wind speed? What direction is it going? Is there a temperature inversion? Like you can manage that, right? Volatilization and vapor drift. So that's turning a liquid into a gas. That can happen 2 days after application, 3 days after application. Like dicamba becomes more volatile as the temperature is higher. So you might spray and it's 25 degrees outside that day. But if the soil is dry and then 3 days later it goes to 35 degrees, now you're at a risk for volatilization. And that's just like, we can barely get the forecast right today. 3 days later seems like a tall order. So that's the part that scares me. So, how does 2,4-D and Dicamba stack up against each other? I do say, so from the work that's been done so far in the States, and Missouri State University has probably been the leader on this, where they've compared volatility. I would say that lower volatility doesn't mean no volatility, but trials at a Missouri State University have showed that 2,4-D choline has a lot lower volatility than Dicamba. And I guess as a side note, like there's 2 or 3 people that I respect greatly on this kind of stuff, because I don't know enough about chemistry and volatilization. They don't have a vested interest in this, and they've said that, yeah, the 2,4-D choline products, you don't have to worry as much. Like, it's still a risk, but it's dramatically lower than with Dicamba. So I think, so fine, that gives you a little bit of comfort level. I don't even know how to process that, Henry, because yes, it's lower volatility. No one's ever going to say it's no volatility, because that would just be wrong. So I think maybe we can look at the soybean data to get a bit more comfort around that. I think regardless, so if you're growing like if there's high value crops around you, tomatoes, grapes, like any hort crops, I think regardless of system, you just have to be extra diligent. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Henry?
Yeah, I think, I'd be pretty cautious to use it around grapes or tomatoes or tobacco. I do think, whether it's Xtend Flex or Enlist, in those cases, maybe it's nice to have Liberty so that you can go post and not worry, because Liberty's contact, really, you're not going to hurt the neighbor's vegetables unless you're really aggressive right against, you basically hit them, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
let's be clear on that though, Henry, too. Like, because I get your point. Like, Liberty's a contact herbicide. If it drifts, it's not going to cause lasting damage. It could still cause damage in the year of application, which could be, detrimental. But yeah, like at least with the systemic herbicides, if they drift on, that could be, that would suck on a perennial crop to have it happen more than 1 year, right? Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, like, I mean, grapes, I guess you could look at this picture and say, hey, there's less injury with 2,4-D than Dicamba. That's kind of like, I don't know, that's the worst consolation prize ever, right? Like, they still injure the crap out of sensitive species. So I think we just have to be super mindful about it. But I think, like, practically speaking, so I think growers that farm and plant soybeans around areas with high value crops get this, and have to be extra mindful. But if we look at kind of what's typically happened in the US around like drift onto sensitive soybeans, this work was done recently by Kevin Bradley out of Missouri State University. This is the timing of dicamba drift and its impact on soybean yield. It should be pointed out that, like, at any drift point, there is some level of visual injury. Like, you're going to see the cupping, but if that drift occurs at R1, right, the early reproductive phase, that's where you start to see, or you can see, significant yield loss. So they've seen up to 16% yield loss when drift occurred at R1. So, soybeans are just super sensitive to dicamba, and very, very low rates of dicamba, and R1 is the most sensitive stage. And hopefully we can get beyond this narrative of drift occurs at other stages, that, oh, it might bump yield. Like, that's largely been disproven. It might make you feel good, but it's cowpucky, right? Like, it's never a good thing. Any response to that? I don't know. Yeah.
I was just going to say, so you're talking on the Dicamba side. Okay, you're going to 2,4-D now. That's good. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, so I think what is encouraging, whether, there's, and this gets around the discussion of lower volatility and all that kind of stuff. Again, we can control physical drift, but if we can't control volatilization, that's problematic. I think the kind of saving grace on the 2,4-D side is when they've looked at 2,4-D choline drifting at the same stages that I just showed with Dicamba. Even though there was injury, right? The strapping, the kind of the similar injury, there was not a significant yield loss, which I think just speaks to soybeans being a little, you just need higher rates of 2,4-D to cause significant damage that would lead to yield loss. So I think, I guess that's comforting from the perspective of, if drift happens and I'm surrounded by soybeans, that is reassuring. Although to be truthful, right, like if you sprayed Enlist Duo has glyphosate and it's IP soybeans beside you, it's the Roundup then that's going to kill them, right? So drift is never a good thing, but at least if the 2,4-D part happens, soybeans seem to be just a little bit more tolerant.
Boy, if my grandfather was around today, he'd be a little disappointed not seeing that little bump from the 2,4-D that he always said that we would get.
Yes, it's a common, it's almost dogma, but Dr. Andrew Kniss did a paper on that, a meta-analysis paper, and showed that that's like there's nothing in the literature to support that. So
Right.
I guess urban legends stay alive. All right, let's just close off on some considerations. So this has happened. I've experienced this 4 times in the last 25 years. It's pretty rare, but I would say with both products, we don't want to be applying those if heavy rain is forecasted shortly after application. I think Henry alluded to this a little bit, but it's a highly water soluble product. If you get surface water runoff to neighboring fields, you're going to see dicamba injury. I've witnessed it 3 times, and then one time, like even in a demo trial. So this picture here is at the Winchester Research Station. We were doing kind of faux dicamba drift. So we were spraying dicamba over certain soybean plots. It rained like the night that we applied dicamba. The water ponded. And here, that just happened to be where we sprayed dicamba. This was our control for comparison. And just do a little zoom in on that, like where the water lied until it could drain, like we saw massive dicamba injury. So it's water soluble, it'll move with surface water. And if it's moving, it's whatever way the hill slopes, right? And that's problematic. So in terms of like considerations, like the exciting part of the new technologies, I see some options here. Like everyone always asks about field horsetail control. We'll never control field horsetail. Let's get that out of our heads, but maybe we can burn it off for the year. I've seen nice results with Liberty, but I get keen about, could you do a Liberty 2,4-D combo? Because 2,4-D has activity on field horsetail. So I guess for those of you that have struggled with field horsetail, you've tried all the normal list of characters that are supposed to do well. I think this is something to look at. We struggle with Vetch at the Allure Research Station. We hate it. And part of the challenge with Vetch is it comes up super late. So if we compare the 2 systems, Xtend versus Enlist, yeah, dicamba at the high rate, a little bit nicer on Vetch than 2,4-D choline at the high rate. But if I have to spray this now, getting close to flowering, just given the volatility issues, I may be more likely to approach 2,4-D as a post application. And then admittedly, I've had decent luck with Liberty. So the Liberty 2,4-D combo again gets me interested. For those that really struggle with Vetch and have tried everything and nothing's worked, I think that combo is intriguing for sure. And then Henry, you mentioned perennial sow thistle. I mean, that's a problem one for sure for many people. I guess I would say on that, so we know that Roundup is pretty decent at controlling perennial sow thistle. The challenge is it usually grows back. Like this picture here is growth room stuff, granted, but 4 weeks after application, it comes back up. And you can get decent sow thistle control with glyphosate, but sometimes you have to apply it 3 times to get there, right? I wonder whether the phenoxy herbicides, maybe inhibit that, that regrowth enough that you can go in there once. Certainly in your strategy, Henry, if you're going in with something like Canopy Pro Pre, and then you're saving like Enlist Duo for, a post application, maybe that's all you need, right? You avoid that having to go in twice to deal with regrowth. So that would be, that would be the one other weed that where I think there's potential there. So I don't know, I think, for time wise, we're getting pretty close to our 40, 45 minutes. I guess any last parting questions, Henry or Chuck, around this technology, or kind of unanswered questions?
No, I don't know, Henry, you got something there?
Well, I mean, we could just ask Mike what he think. Like, if all genetics were equal, what platform would you plant on your farm?
There you go. Let's throw the ball in his court.
Yeah. I go back to what I said earlier in terms of I'm going to pick the one with the best genetics. Like, I've grown Xtend soybeans, but I haven't used Dicamba. I think it would largely depend. So I guess here would be my thought. Hey, put me on the spot. It's all good. Dicamba is the better active ingredient, 100%. I think for me personally, the volatility concerns me. Can it be managed? I guess. I don't know, right? So I think my comfort level probably would be more to lean towards right now, especially with the ability to use Liberty. I kind of like to have a couple of options there in the post-emergent window. So I would probably lean, like, genetics being equal, I probably would lean on the truthful answer is I'd get both and compare both, because that's what I like to do. But the Enlist one, just in terms of worrying about the volatilization a little bit less, that's probably where I would lean. But
yeah, and then also having the option of Liberty as well as in the background, right? That makes it a lot nicer too.
Yeah, my first ever job
Yeah.
working in weed science was looking at Liberty Link soybeans with a company called Agrivo Herxt, and I always thought the soybeans looked the weed control system in soybeans I always thought was impressive, but the reason it kind of flopped then, is to Henry's point, is there wasn't any decent genetics, or any of the decent genetics were at like 3,400 corn heat units, right? Like at super long season. And yeah, I'm kind of a fan of Liberty, and so the days are hot. It's a perfect time to spray Liberty. Like it has some value. So 20 years, 25 years later, maybe we get to see its value a bit more.
Yeah, well, that's pretty good. So all of this was really good stuff. Like, this has been very exciting. It's always good.
Exciting.
I think so. Well, especially like those 3 slides with the Happy Days feature. I thought that was amazing. If I would have known you were doing that, I probably would have had the opening with the Happy Days theme rather than me
Right.
talking, right? But,
Yeah. Meanwhile, Henry's like, what the hell's Happy Days? Right?
Yeah, I don't even know.
yeah, he's thinking, what's the guy doing on water skis, eh?
That's right.
Anyways, no, this is all great stuff. So I think at this point we'll probably tackle some questions here from the people out listening.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, that was excellent, guys. We're going to jump right in on some questions here. We've got some pretty interesting questions that popped up here. And just to carry on with the discussion that we finished up with in regards to what platform. So we got to remember that XtendFlex is out right at the moment, right? And we at Maizex have a couple XtendFlex varieties, which gives us that opportunity to use, take advantage of all the platforms, basically, right? So using that Liberty later on. But there's a question here. So this grower likes his Dicamba and for its weeds control. Is there any additional research being done right now on volatilization from a chemistry or additive perspective, Mike?
Yeah, so that there's a lot of people looking at that, especially in the U.S. I think there's and until that technology is available and is proven, that will kind of improve comfort level around that. I think largely in Ontario, what's being done to manage that effectively is using that pass in more kind of a pre-emerge early post setting to take advantage of early season weed control, and that's doing that when air temperatures are cooler and less likely for volatility concerns. I think that's our best strategy right now to minimize the volatility risk. But I've no doubt that there'll be products and advancements in chemistry that will only raise the bar in terms of lowering volatility. But I'm not aware of anything offhand to be specific that we could use in Ontario that would defer, or else they would be recommendations on the product labels.
Perfect. Okay, so this is from Peter Johnson. So you talked about controlling vetch. So some recent work being done in Harrow is promoting hairy vetch as a high nitrogen fixing cover crop planted following wheat. So which vetch are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking. Hairy vetch is an annual. Tufted vetch is for Peter. I'll say Vicia cracka just to throw out some scientific names, just because then I can use it occasionally. So it's a perennial. It was first brought, as a forage crop, but it just didn't yield well. But it's a perennial, tremendous. Thin rhizomes that make it very persistent, and then it also produces seed, which allows it to spread. So yeah, two totally different species and two different levels of concern. I'm talking about the perennial weedy vetch.
Right on. And I got a question here. What water volume is suggested for applying Enlist?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, for both systems, I think 20 gallons per acre is where you want to be, and especially then if you're thinking of Enlist one with a Liberty, the more coverage is better, and especially when using Liberty, 20 gallons is where you want to be, and even better than 15 gallons.
Right on. We got a question here. Talking about Palmer Amaranth. It's becoming a pretty big issue in the U.S. right now. Do you expect that to be an issue here in Canada? And if so, which of the two programs would work best, or do they both work well on it?
Yeah, so I think they both work well on it. So I think both, regardless of whether system you have, if Palmer Amaranth showed up, you can deal with that with both systems. Yeah, I guess what I would say in the Palmer Amaranth is I remember being on crop tour when I was an Aggie and seeing water hemp in the Midwest United States, and at the time they said, oh, it'll never be up in your neck of the woods, you're too far north, it doesn't like that environment, and here we are some 25 years later. So I think Palmer Amaranth, I have every reason to believe it'll be here at some point. I just don't know when that will be. Hopefully it won't be. It'll be for a while. Like, it's been found in Ontario. In 2007, it was found along a rail yard. We haven't been able to find it since, and let's hope it stays that way.
Right on. Got a question here about your horsetail discussion that you're having. Hold on here. Where did it go? Yeah, so how do you get the best control on horsetail? A 2-pass with Enlist Duo or a 2,4-D plus Liberty? And what timing?
Yeah, so the one thing that is fairly clear about like horsetail sensitivity to herbicides is it typically is best when it's like 6 inches tall, 6 to 12 inches tall. So actually, the more vegetative and bushy it is, like, it's almost contrary to how you view most weed species in terms of you want them small. Horsetail is one where you want the vegetative growth stage and you want it taller. Like, I'm going to say 6 inches, right? 15 centimeters. The challenge with that, of course, is that sometimes you're waiting a while to get that in season. So I do think, like, a strategy in soybeans that would be good to look at would be the broad strike RC kind of pre-plant, pre-emerge, and then hopefully you suppress or manage the population to a certain extent, but it's going to eventually grow back. And I guess that's why I like, the idea of like a Liberty or Liberty 2,4-D post, is then you can allow it to get a little bit taller and hit it there. I actually would probably go with the Liberty 2,4-D. If I was to experiment, I would go with the Liberty 2,4-D combo, because I think there's value in using both. Coverage again is key. Like you'd be at 20 gallons per acre. And then also with kind of the humility that something that works on one farm could totally look like it wasn't even applied 2 farms down with the same weed, right? So field horsetail has always been the most frustrating weed to me, where I can get good control in one place and then repeat exactly what I did 3 concessions over, and it totally is different. So yeah, I whether it's Enlist E3 soybeans or whether it's Xtend Flex soybeans, the Liberty hormone herbicide combo, I think that's good to look at.
Right. Question here from Michael. A herbicide passive Liberty and Enlist is a combination of contact and systemic herbicide. Will there be instances where the Liberty will burn too quickly for the 2,4-D to move through the weed? For example, different weed species, time of day application, temperature of the day, etc.
Yep. I think that's always a concern. The work that's been done so far in a lot of the annual broadleaf weeds in the US with the tank mix combination has shown to be positive. I don't doubt that there's maybe some scenarios where, yeah, the burn is a little bit too fast. I do think though that because both Dicamba and 2,4-D are relatively fast acting systemic herbicides, right? It's not like glyphosate that you start to see the impact 7 to 10 days after application. Like you're usually seeing plant response 3 days after application. So I do think they are, even though one's systemic, one's contact, they both work very fast. So I would anticipate not as many concerns versus having a tank mix of contact systemic, where the systemic takes a while to work.
Right. Right on. Anything to add there, Henry, or like have
No,
you had experience with that?
I mean, I think we can look at other products too, like we use Aragon and glyphosate up front, right? There's a burner and a systemic product, right? Yeah, I wouldn't be overly concerned, but that's, yeah.
Right on. Okay, so here's a little question here that has been asked by a lot, and we get different answers all the time. So timing of Roundup at flowering, does it cause any yield damage on soybeans?
Oh, you mean like an in-crop application at flowering?
At flowering time, yep.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of that being an issue in terms of I mean, it's labeled for early flowering. I'm not aware of. Yeah, I mean, now I'm curious. I'm gonna look up and see if there's anything in the literature, but I don't like yeah.
Well,
I mean, if there is a yield loss, like sometimes what happens is like you're going in at that late stage, usually because something's gone wrong on the weed control side, and that might explain the yield dump. But yeah.
Yeah, I just remember like when Roundup Ready beans first came out, there was a big caveat there that they didn't want you spraying at flowering time because it could affect the flowers. But with years of experience behind and doing all this all the time, I've never really seen it myself as causing an issue. But there's still talk of it out there. So no, you're exactly right. If you're going in that late, it's probably because you have poor weed control, and the weed control is what's causing your yield loss, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, who knows? I think more often than not, it would be of minor concern.
Right. And a question here in regards to IP soybeans. What would you recommend as being the best weed control for IP soybeans?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of favorites, but keep in mind they're based on on a fairly small sample size of different locations, right? So I think that's what you always got to be careful with. It sounds like I'm going to skirt around this, answering this question like a typical government guy, but I'm not going to. I think the key thing, though, that we find in terms of consistency is like 3 modes of action are kind of a must now in IP soybeans. So like the pre-emergent herbicide program doesn't have like 3 different modes of action. It's almost a necessity because we run into herbicide-resistant pigweed or lamb's quarters, that kind of thing. The 2 programs in the work that we've done out of the University of Guelph. So I guess I would first say that there's probably 6 to 8 programs that on any given Sunday will do a great job. Like every dog has its day, so to speak. Some of the more consistent programs over the last 12 seasons have been things like Triactor, and then like one thing that Henry mentioned, like Canopy Pro Boundary has also been a very good program. Although that high rate ascend course, you have to be a little bit careful what soil you put it on. But those are kind of my 2 favorite in terms of them being most consistent. But Commenza is another decent program, and then Authority Boundary Liquid is decent. Its main weakness is ragweed, and then Conquest Plus Prowl is not a bad little program either. So I have 2 that are most consistent, but there's a number that I don't think you put you at a disadvantage. The 2 main kind of 3 main weeds that we have inconsistency issues on in our trials is ragweed, lamb's quarters, and then like barnyard grass. So yeah, like I'm focusing on products that are a little bit more consistent on those 3 weeds.
We've had a couple questions coming in here. This horsetail's really got people thinking, and there's some talk here about MCPA. So MCPA, we know, does a pretty good job on horsetail, right? And the question is, the one in particular question is, can you apply MCPA pre-plant ahead of E3 soybeans?
Legally? Legally, no. Legally, you could, because the label is silent. The MCPA label is silent on recropping restrictions. In theory, you could spray MCPA and then 30 days later plant soybeans. I know that's not very practical. Here's what I would say. Yeah, I have 2 years of research on MCPA ester in that kind of window. And yeah, like crop safety, I'm not necessarily concerned of. I think the risk in a hypothetical research setting, so I'm gonna be careful there, is MCPA is very similar to 2,4-D in terms of risk to injury. I think the bigger question then is, is the field horsetail at a stage that you kind of need to get the best control of MCPA? So because I'm going to go back to that, like it needs to be 6 inches tall. So we've used like MCPA at the Aloha Research Station. The example I'll give is like we had a block where it was both kind of corn and soybeans, and so we went in with MCPA there prior to emergence. And the challenge is the horsetail control is kind of underwhelming because it was like the horsetail itself was like 5 centimeters tall. So like with MCPA, if you're going to kind of go down that road of riskiness, I'd like to see the horsetail there and around 6 inches tall and in the vegetative stage, which you might not get, right?
Right. Okay, yeah, that just seems interesting how there's a lot of talk on horsetail, like it's been around forever and we've tried everything possible to try to take care of it. And it just seems like there's just nothing that really grabs hold of it, right? So, yeah, so the time is now right around 11 o'clock. Want to thank Mike and Henry for the great presentation that we've had so far. So for those that that need to jump off the call at this time, because we said it was going to be an hour long, we'd like to thank you all for joining us. We still have a lot of questions here to go, so we're going to stay on for until we can get through these questions, but no later than 11:30. So if you wish to stay on and listen, that's great. But if you wish to leave, if you have to leave, again, we we really thank you for joining us. So let's carry on with a few questions here. So there's a question here about ragweed control with 2,4-D and the burn down. Even though you say there's very little residual, is Dicamba better?
On common ragweed, like, yeah, so if you have a merged ragweed, Dicamba's probably equivalent, like maybe give the nod to Dicamba. I think the real value of Dicamba on ragweed is you're getting some level of residual control. But if the ragweed's up, yeah, I'd probably err to Dicamba over 2,4-D, but.
Right. Okay. Back to the tough vetch here. Just a quick question. Maybe you mentioned it, I can't remember, but how tall should the tough vetch be for more lasting impact on control of tough vetch?
That's a really good question. I imagine, although like there's not any work done that I'm aware of, is if it was in the early flowering stage, that ideally probably would be the best time to hit it. The challenge with that is that's usually pretty, within a couple of weeks or 3 weeks before harvest. Like it's late in the season is what I'm getting at. So yeah, I think if, yeah, it would be yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I'm kind of processing it now. Like, yeah, I think the early flowering stage probably, from a physiology perspective, is the ideal time to target application. I just don't know if that could ever work, because that seems it would be very late in the season.
Okay. Does Enlist offer any control on climbing bindweed? What would be a good option in soybeans post?
Yeah, so by climbing bindweed, I assume that the individual means like field bindweed or hedge bindweed. And yeah, so Roundup's always been okay on field. Like there's been a bunch of work on field bindweed to show that it's a lot like horsetail in that there seems to be different populations or biotypes that are more or less sensitive to glyphosate, and with field bindweed, traditionally the addition of 2,4-D has been very beneficial. The addition of Dicamba has been very beneficial in terms of consistency of field bindweed control. So that would be a weed in either one of these systems that I think provides you an opportunity to maybe get not necessarily better control, but unlikely that you're going to get a bunch of regrowth, because I'm just kind of recalling now. Sadly, I do some deep dives on labels, and like there's some wording in some of the older 2,4-D labels around like this will provide season-long suppression of field bindweed, which kind of implies that it's still there. Like if you're expecting a scorched earth with field bindweed, probably not going to happen.
Right. Now, could we get better better control on the weeds that you mentioned earlier with Liberty 200 SN if we used AMS or tank mixed it with an MSO, for example?
Yeah, so originally when that product came out, there was a couple of species in particular where the addition of ammonium sulfate improved control, and that was lamb's quarters and velvet leaf. So, ammonium sulfate doesn't necessarily improve control over all species. I think it's usually the ones that are a little bit difficult to wet and to penetrate the leaf surface. Yeah, the methylated seed oil. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good thing to look at. Like as a general rule of thumb, methylated seed oils improve uptake. I don't know if it would be beneficial in the case of Liberty. Otherwise, it would already be on the label. Is kind of my go-to response when I don't know off the hand.
Right. Okay. And keeping in the theme of what Horst talked about last week and at the Ontario Ag Conference, where he kind of put it out there about the no-till and going back to tillage. Got a question here. So for a no-till or a reduced tillage system, should we be considering tillage in soybeans to keep a lot of these weeds like fleabane under control in the spring?
I think vertical tillage is helpful, but to a point. So I think where it's helpful in the case of fleabane is it will whittle down the population, and then there's less reliance that your herbicide system has to, kill 4 million plants of fleabane per acre. But we've seen with tillage on fleabane that unless you get it super small, you need to knock a lot of dirt off the roots of fleabane to get really good control. So I could show you pictures where we have done trials where pre-plant tillage definitely has improved control of fleabane. It doesn't mean though that there's no fleabane that you have to deal with as well, right? It doesn't give you the free pass on the, mixing Aragon and 2,4-D or using Dicamba, but I think it's helpful in the perspective of it drives down population, and then you're asking less of your herbicide.
Right. Anything, Henry? Look like you had something.
Well, I don't think we should be relying on tillage for all our weed control. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think there's a good place for it. And like Mike said, you'll drive your populations down. But man, sometimes, some of those bigger plants that you get with vertical tillage and you flip over, they come back even worse than they were before. They got, well, we've all seen the fleabane with 5 shoots, right? Yeah, they're not fun to control in season. I think you just relying on tillage isn't enough. So,
Right on. And Mike, recommendation for wild parsnip. Would either one of these platforms work the best or better, or both equal?
Yeah, probably not. Neither one of them probably is going to be great on wild parsnip. Wild parsnip's from the carrot family, and we talked about, wild carrot and how it's relatively tolerant to 2,4-D and Dicamba. Yeah, wild parsnip is one of those ones. Yeah, it's kind of rare to see in field crops. So you typically see it in like permanent pastures, roadsides, that kind of thing. It is one of those ones that benefits greatly from fall application versus spring application. So I guess as a starting point on wild parsnip, I would go with products that. So we haven't done it like here. I'm stammering. Our knowledge bank of how to kill wild parsnip in field crops is pretty small. In rangeland and roadsides like Clearview and products like that have been very good, but in crop like Roundup's decent, and then things like Classic are okay, but it all depends how old the wild parsnip is at the time of application. Like if it's seedling, they're relatively easy to control. If it's a persistent 2, 3, 4-year-old plant, it's tough to kill. It's not a great answer. So that if that person wants to follow up with me on the field crop side, like happy to follow up because we could do more work in that area.
Sounds good. This horsetail keeps popping up here. So does broad strike dual applied help suppress horsetail from emergent after it's applied, or applied pre-emergence in corn and soybeans?
Yeah, so does it have post activity or pre-activity? It probably has more post activity than pre-activity. And really, if you see inconsistencies from field to field of control, yeah, it'll either be because the biotype's tolerant to broad strike, or that there was not very much field horsetail up at the time of application.
Right. Okay. And then here's a pokeweed question. So what would be good control measure for pokeweed?
Yeah, so recently I came to discover that the herbicide Permit has pokeweed listed on its label. So if you were in dry beans or corn, that would be an option, with the caveat on the label. It's like the sensitive stage is like, that big, right? Like it's 2-leaf or 4-leaf or something like that. So it's pretty small. This is a bit fascinating to me because I'd like to know how big a problem this is in field. Like when I first started, we did some work on pokeweed, but we pretty much had to do it all at the edge of field because that's where it was. Like it was largely in fence rows. And what I will say is, like, if you allow it to get on the bigger side, like once it starts getting above 12 inches, it's pretty tolerant to pretty much any broadcast spray, like even glyphosate. And really you have to kind of approach it from like an almost a wicking or a spot spraying perspective, which I know is not a great answer because that's like not super practical in crop. But it is very tolerant as it gets bigger.
Right.
So, yeah, it's kind of like milkweed, Chuck, like back in the day where you had to go in with a squirt bottle or a wiper and hit individual plants.
Yeah,
Is the
exactly.
horrible answer.
Yeah. So here's another one, another good one for you. What about snake grass? Snake grass and soybeans, Enlist or Xtend?
So snake grass is a relative of field horsetail. So people are finding unique ways to get field horsetail into the conversation.
Aren't we?
And I don't have anything dramatically different to say other than what generally, so observationally, 2 years ago, there was a field we were working in, and the grower it was using a 2x rated glyphosate plus Aragon plus merge, and had boundary in there, but I don't think that's consequential to this. And he had a mixture of field horsetail and snake grass, and it did a very nice job of blacking the snake grass and horsetail. So it was largely the Aragon doing that. But I'm sure there's people listening or watching that have mixed reviews with horsetail and Aragon, which again goes back to both those species. Like what works well in one field doesn't work well in another. So I think the approach I would take would be identical to field horsetail, and that's not great, right?
Okay, so can you go over the best strategy to manage perennial sow thistle, both in Roundup ready beans and in IP beans?
Yeah. Yeah, I personally had fairly bad field perennial sow thistle pressure, and I was able to get it down to a fairly manageable level where I don't, where it's not driving my decision making anymore. And how I got to that, to be totally truthful, it's not flashy, is just consistently hitting it in the fall. And with nothing really more special than like glyphosate, sometimes glyphosate 2,4-D, but a commitment to is almost every year that you can fall applications. And that might mean stretching outside of your comfort level and hitting, corn stalks in mid-November or late November, right? But fall applications are key. And I guess where I am at on the IP soybean side is it's just really difficult to control perennial sow thistle and IP soybeans to the point that if it's any appreciable size or density of perennial sow thistle, I just think you save yourself the hassle and don't go there. Classic is probably Classic is the best product. We've done side-by-side trials, but it suppresses, like it's not amazing, and it's slow. And we tried adding Bazargan and Reflex to improve control, and we just can't do it. So to me, the fall applications are key. And then in wheat, I think you got good arsenals of herbicides to hit it in wheat. But maybe you're applying closer to flag leaf, which might make Peter uncomfortable. But in corn, I think there's lots of good options there. Just even straight glyphosate. But the key is to in crop manage the vegetative mass, and then in the fall get drive product down to the root system. And I know it's flashy and it seems overly simplistic, but after about 5 years, you see the impact. So that's probably the other thing, is it's a 5-year plan, and it's never taking your foot off the gas once you get to that level of it being reasonable.
Right. So here's one on velvet leaf. Okay, how do we get rid of it? I don't think we ever could we? Because I remember velvet leaf when I was knee high to a grasshopper pulling and cutting those out of beans. But they say, do we pick it? Is there a special program that works the best on it? Or
super persistent seed too, right, Mike? Like that is one of the wonders of velvet leaf.
Yeah, like if you could combine Velvet Leaf's seed production with Canada Fleabane's lack of dormancy, then you might have a chance. Like that's usually the trouble is you have a big seed, a thick seed coat, and then dormancy. And so yeah, like it just so the thickness of the seed is important because like even if you bury it with a moldboard plow, fine. It's nicely stored there. When it comes back up in a few years, it'll be ready to germinate. And yeah, the seed viability can last 30 years, right? As a general rule of thumb, post-emergent applications are more effective on velvet leaf simply because it's not that the soil applied herbicides don't work well on velvet leaf. It's just that velvet leaf can germinate from deeper depths because the seed is deeper. So if you get like a layer of soil applied herbicide here, and then you get the seed germinating underneath, like it can blow past that layer. And that's why soil applied herbicides usually aren't as good. But you know, I guess the real question is post-emergent, is the challenge that that's originating from this question, is it that you're not able to kill the velvet leaf that are up? Or is it that whatever you spray in 2 or 3 weeks, there's a new flush of velvet leaf? And that is problematic. But I will go back to that's now at least with either one of these systems, like Xtend Flex or Enlist, you know, going now if we can maybe do a final pass with Liberty, kind of as we get to flowering or before flowering, that might be helpful in terms of squashing those secondary flushes. But I mean, here's the reality: like you're going to have that pesky little velvet leaf that
Right.
comes up in August. That'll accelerate seed growth, and sadly, either robots have to get cheaper, or incentives for our children and relatives to pull plants has to become better, right? It's basic that like I know this again. It sounds like advice from Captain Obvious, but you have to stop seed production in velvet leaf to really get rid of that species.
Right on. Back to the Enlist emerge or Enlist Xtend here. So to get 90% plus on control ratings, do we need to focus more on time of day for our spraying systems in regards to post-emergent applications?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so there's two things I would say that I think are influential. One is water volume, 20 gallons per acre. The second part that I don't think we gloss over, we don't really appreciate it enough, is that anytime you see those 90 to 100% ratings, those are based on field trials where someone's walking with a handheld boom at about 5 miles per hour. So it's low, it's slow, it's lots of water. So coverage is great. So that's we're getting droplets on leaf, and that's huge. On the time of day thing, there's kind of two things to unpack there. So the easy narrative that people use is that, well, we should be spraying all herbicides if we want to maximize control between 9 and 5, right? Like government hours. It's not that simple. It might. So time of day, like daytime spraying is better in that whatever leaf you're trying to hit, velvet leaf or lamb's quarters, those leaves are more likely to be parallel to the soil because they're wanting to harvest as much sunlight, and they're relatively easy targets to hit. Whereas in the evening, they like lamb's quarters, all the leaves go up, and then velvet leaf, they droop down like soybeans, and they're just tougher to hit. And then like if you think of a waxy surface, it's going to be easier to penetrate in the heat of the day because it's soft or it's more permeable than in the evening. So time of day matters from that perspective. But I think the more important thing that we don't pay attention to, well, because it's never been much of an issue. Well, it's a concept that they use in Australia that I think we probably need to look at more here, and that's delta T, which is basically it's considering the temperature and relative humidity at the time of application, because if the temperature is too hot and the relative humidity is too low, you lose droplets to not volatilization, evaporation. And then if the temperature is too cool and too humid, particles stay suspended. All this to say there's extremes where the droplet's not hitting the leaf. And so, yeah, time of day is important, but if you look back at a lot of that good time of day research that Peter Sickman did, there were outliers in the early morning or late evening, but more in the early morning where control is quite good. And it's, if you looked at the delta T value, it's because it was nicely in that sweet spot of the right temperature and the right humidity. So there is actually, you can Google a delta T chart because it's pretty simple. Like it's like, here's your ideal spray window. You look at temperature, you look at relative humidity and see where you fall. Like I think, and the importance of that is it just means more droplets are likely to get to the leaf under certain conditions. I know that was lengthy, but so all this to say is time of day. If you can spray middle of the day, for sure. But I think we all know that wind speeds are usually better on either end. And I'm not saying, so then like just be mindful of delta T, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned delta T, and Peter Johnson just mentioned that you know, it's used in Alberta all the time, delta T. So
Yeah, like
yeah, go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
No, I think it's something probably we should pay more attention to because, like, yeah, again, going back to Peter's work, like, you could see great control of velvet leaf at 6 a.m. in the morning, and then when you looked at the delta T, it's because it was like in the sweet spot. Whereas usually, like, if you think of cool and humid, that's usually early morning, so delta T is not going to be great, right?
Right. So back to wild carrot here for a second. Is there typically enough regrowth post soybean harvest, mid to late October, to get adequate control?
Yes. That's going to be the most succinct answer I give today. Yes.
That was an easy one, eh? Right on.
Well, yeah. I think we have, there's a little downside to being aggressive on the fall front. It'll look like you won't be impressed with anything you do in the fall. So do not judge your activities and how it looks in the fall. Judge it on how it looks in the spring.
Right. Okay. And question here on dog bane in soybeans and seed corn. What do you recommend?
Yeah, it's pretty unsexy, just like pokeweed and everything. Like it's spot applications, it's wick applications. Like we have done some work in dog bane and soybeans and corn, and yeah, the higher rates of glyphosate broadcast do an okay job, but to get really good, effective, consistent control, you just have to kind of wipe product up on the actual plants to get control.
Right.
And you hope there's enough dog bane beetles around copulating because they eat the leaf tissue. If there's enough of them around mating, they sometimes can get rid of dog bane for you.
Right. There you go. Classic on beans. When is the best time to apply classic, and what is the best rate? Well, I think the rate is the label rate, right? 144 grams. Is that changed?
Yeah, it's 14.4 grams.
14.4. Sorry, yeah.
144 grams would be problematic. You have great weed control, and it's kind of sad that I know
we take
that
care
off
of
the
everything,
cuff.
wouldn't we? Yeah.
So with that product, I'm more worried about weed stage than crop stage. And so, you know, when broadleaf weeds are in the, like pigweed and ragweed are in the 4-leaf, 6-leaf stage, I think that's ideal for classic. And if that means that your soybeans are at the unifoliate stage, so be it. Yeah, it's yeah, and I think you need good water volume on that as well. And yeah, I don't have much more to say on that. Is smaller is better, 4 to 6, and yeah.
Right on. So we're approaching the end here. I've got one more question here, and this is a little bit about resistance. So I don't know if somewhere in your conversation you mentioned you're talking lamb's quarter, because I don't know where the question actually comes from, unless it's something he heard. But it makes him worried when people say hit lamb's quarters twice with Roundup, and it still won't kill it. So are we just making a run at resistance here if we keep on pushing Roundup on lamb's quarters?
Yeah, I think the important thing for people today to take home on the lamb's quarters front is there's 2 people actively looking at that, because there's some evidence that maybe there's maybe there's populations that can just, metabolize the herbicide a little bit better. It's not like traditional resistance. Practically that doesn't matter to many people. But so Peter Sikkema and Martin Laforêt, he's with Ag Canada. They're two people that if you experience poor control of lamb's quarters with glyphosate, then I would contact either one of them, and I can help facilitate that, because they've been grabbing seed from those populations and looking into that issue. Yeah, I don't think our solution is more product 2 or 3 times. I think with lamb's quarters, if that is your big driver, there's plenty of research to support soil applied herbicides improving the control that you receive with glyphosate. And that's a function of, like, there's less of them to deal with, and they're usually smaller at the time of application because you're not waiting for every last one to get up. And then the other thing too is, like, I think what happens in some areas is that you maybe underestimate the amount of product needed to kill the size of weed that you have. So you're hopeful that, like, 0.7 liters per acre will take it out, but if it's 15 centimeters or 6 inches tall, it needs 1.34, right? So I agree. Like, I don't think, we'll hit lamb's quarters twice with glyphosate is good, because ultimately you're going down the road of selecting for that lamb's quarter that can handle that and then produce seed. So going back to, and I'm mindful of time here, Chuck, going back to the Enlist Xtend conversation, and that's at least now in lamb's quarters where you'd have 2 modes of action working on it in the post-emergent window.
Now, sometimes, Mike, with lamb's quarters too, when we're dry and hot, it'll harden off, and that is also probably some of the reason we're missing it with glyphosate, right? Like, I've seen that a few times. I think you got to keep that in mind when you're spraying lamb's quarters with glyphosate as well, right?
Yep, leaf surface is harder to penetrate, and then also as the plants get bigger, there's some research that shows they produce more calcium, and that's it's a cation that binds glyphosate. So if glyphosate hits the leaf surface and makes it into the leaf surface, there could be calcium that's tying it up from moving to the growing point, right? So yeah, all good points.
Excellent, guys. Well, this has been very, very interesting, as it always is when we get Mike speaking and Henry chirping in and sharing some experience that he has down there with some resistant weeds, because I know there are resistant weeds in Haldeman and Niagara, and in fact, there's resistant weeds all over Ontario today. So again, thanks again for your insight, guys, and I'd like to thank everyone that joined us today. And I hope everyone enjoyed the session. So just a reminder before we do sign off here that next week, Tuesday at 10 a.m., our topic is going to be strip tillage with fertilizer. Can the planter run free? And that's featuring Ben Rosner with Omafra. He's corn specialist, and our color commentator is going to be Mike Corneliuson. So hopefully everybody can join us for that discussion. And again, guys, thanks again for your insight today. It was a very, very good session, and hope everybody has a great week.